Hello everyone, my name is Fadlal Fajduani. Today I will explain about independent clause and dependent clause. So before get started, I apologize if my explanation is not good because I didn't use any whiteboard. So let's get started. First, let's start with the word clause. A clause is a part of a sentence that contains a subject and some kind of predicate. The sentence after the main stop we went out on our bikes contains two clauses. The rain stopped and we went out on our bikes. The subjects rain and we are given something to do, thereby completing the idea. By definition, a dependent clause does not form a simple sentence by itself, also called a subordinate clause. It is connected to the main clause of a sentence by a sentence conjunction, such as that or when. Take this example. I went out on the bike that Mary gave me for my birthday. The main clause of the sentence I went out on the bike. A complete idea that can stand on its own as a complete sentence. The words that follow that Mary gave me for my birthday are a dependent clause. Acting subordinate to the main clause, they contain a complete idea in their own right, including a subject and corresponding verb. But the existence of the subordinating conjunction that indicates that the clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence. It depends on the main clause because the main clause contains the object bike that the verb in the independent clause gave targets. An independent clause, in contrast, can stand alone as a complete simple sentence, even though it is usually functioning as part of a larger sentence. For a sentence to be complete, all it needs is a subject and a verb. She's shy. No part of the sentence depends on some element expressed outside the sentence. In many cases, in fact, the only thing that distinguishes an independent clause from a dependent clause is the presence of subordinating conjunction. Consider what the addition of subordinating conjunction does to this example. As you can see, these are the example. Independent, we arrive early to the party. Dependent, when we arrive early to the party. Full sentence, the host was surprised when we arrived early to the party. You can see and read the example. Okay, so I will explain a bit. The dependent clauses in these examples make no sense on their own as complete talks because the subordinating conjunction that are attached to them. When signs although depend on information outside of the clause. They do, however, all seem like pretty normal text message. Okay, I will explain independent and dependent clause. Independent and dependent clause are the building blocks of sentence. A single independent clause expresses a complete thought and can be a sentence by itself. Dependent clause don't express a complete thought, but they add more information to sentence. When you join independent and dependent clause with conjunction and proper punctuation, they create compound and complex complex sentences that are fun and engaging to read. Okay, so in this slide, there is independent clause defined. An independent clause is a full sentence. It doesn't need to be joined to any other clauses because it contains all the information necessary to be a complete sentence. Independent clause have three components. First, subject tells the reader what the sentence is about. Second is predicate or action tells the reader what the subject is doing. Last but not least, a complete thought, a full picture of what happened or was said. Examples of independent clauses. Independent clauses can be simple sentences that consist of a subject and a verb. For example, Jim reads. Jim is the subject, reads is the verb. Sarah teach. Sarah is the subject, teach is the verb. Mark plays. Mark is the subject, plays is the verb. If you add direct objects to this sentence, they are still independent clauses. Jim reads the newspaper. Sarah teaches high school. Mark plays basketball. Join independent clauses to other independent clauses with coordinating conjunction for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, or semicolons. These new sentences are called compound sentences. Jim reads the newspaper, so he understands what's happening in town. Sarah teaches high school, and she volunteers at homeless shelter. Mark plays basketball. He's not very good. Common errors combining independent clauses. When you combine independent clauses without proper punctuation, you get a run-on sentence. For example, Jim reads the newspaper. He understands what's happening in town is a run-on sentence. When two independent clauses are joined only by a comma, such as Jim reads the newspaper, he understands what's happening in town. It creates a grammatical error called a comma splice. Avoid these common mistakes by combining independent clauses correctly. Dependent clause defined. Like independent clauses, dependent clauses include a subject and a verb, but unlike independent clauses, they don't express a complete thought. They add more information to an independent clause to clarify meaning but cannot stand alone. There are several different types of dependent clause, including first, noun clauses function as subjects or objects in sentence. Second is adverbial clauses function as adverbs to modify verbs, adjectives or other adverbs. Last but not least, relative clauses function as adjectives to modify nouns. Example of dependent clauses right here. When dependent clauses stand on their own, they don't make such sense. For example, who gave me present? Because he loves her. That used to be a video store. However, when you add them to independent clauses, their meaning is clear. I'd like to know who gave me present. It tells who gave me a present is a noun clause that acts as a direct object. He asks her to marry him because he loves her. It tells because he loves her is an adverbial clause that modifies the verb acts. Let's meet at the restaurant that used to be a video store. It tells that used to be a video store is a relative clause that modifies the noun restaurant. And also, you can spot a dependent clauses by the presence of subordinating conjunction such as before, after, because, since, in order, although, whenever, while, or even though. Common errors combining dependent clauses. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone as a full sentence if they are not joined to another clause. They create a sentence fragment. For example, because I forgot my homework is a sentence fragment because it doesn't express a complete thought. When you combine it with an independent clause to make because I forgot my homework, I got sent home. It's no longer a sentence fragment. So, an independent clause is a clause that can stand alone as a sentence, express a complete thought. A dependent clause or subordinate clause is one that cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It doesn't express a complete thought. Remember that a clause has a subject and a verb. Easy examples of dependent and independent clause. In all the examples, the independent clauses are highlighted and the dependent clauses aren't. Also, in each clause, the subject is underlined and the verb is in bold. The patrol had spotted the sniper who was hiding in an attic. That was example. And do you know the butcher who went to court on Saturday? That was an example. I am not tidying the dishes unless Peter helps. When it rains, the daffodils bow their heads. That was an example too. Notice how the shaded clauses could all stand alone as sentence. They are independent clauses. There is some real life examples of dependent and independent clause. For example, the secret of life is honesty. If you can fake that, you've got it made. That was example. Do not confuse clauses and phrases. The non-highlighted text in the example below are not dependent clauses. With no subjects and verbs, they're not clauses. They're adverbial clauses. Okay, now we get into the link between an independent clause and a dependent clause. An independent clause is linked to a dependent clause with a subordinating conjunction. Common ones are after, although, as, because, before, even if, even though, if, provided, rather than, since, so that, then, though, unless, until, whether, while, how, that, what, when, and where. Or a relative pronoun, common ones are which, who, whom, whose, why, whoever, and whosoever. Look at this example. If I held you any closer, I would be on the other side of you. The dependent clause is linked to independent one with the subordinating conjunction if. Wives are people who feel they don't dance enough. It tells us the dependent clause is linked to the independent one with the relative pronoun who. Dependent clause inside independent clauses. Grammarians are divided on whether a dependent clause can be a component of an independent clause. Some say yes and some say no. The no camp claims that a dependent clause must be linked with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun to an independent clause. For example, whoever named it Necking was poor judge of anatomy. This is example. It tells us according to the yes camp, whoever named it Necking is a dependent clause despite being the subject of the independent clause. So there is types of dependent clause. Let's quickly look at dependent clause. They can function as adjective, adverbs, or nouns. Ad- Adjective clause types. As example, I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. It tells us the dependent clause that would have the dependent clause that would have me as a member describes the club is an adjective clause. Adverbial clause type. I find television very educating when it's on. I go into the other room and read a book. It tells us the dependent clause when it's on modifies the verb go. It is an adverbial clause. Non-clause type. For the example, a black cat crossing your path signifies that the animal is going somewhere. It tells us, according to the yes camp, that the animal is going somewhere is a dependent clause despite being part of the independent clause. There is types of sentence structure. The number of independent clauses and dependent clauses in a sentence determines the sentence structure type. There are four. First, simple sentence type. The structure is one independent only. For example, humor is reason got mad. Second, complex sentence type. The structure is one independent and at least dependent. For example, no man goes before his time unless the boss leaves early. Third, compound sentence type. The structure is two independents. I have had a perfectly wonderful evening, but this wasn't it. Last but not least, compound complex sentence type. The structure is at least two independents and at least one dependent. For example, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others. So, guys, there's one thing you should know. Why should you care about independent clause? There's only one reason to care about independent and dependent clause is comma placement. There are three, well, four at a push, noteworthy points linked to comma placement. So, point one, use a comma before an and that links to independent clauses. If you and links to independent clauses, precede it with a comma. This rule does not apply only to and it applies to any coordinating conjunction. Put another way, the rule is use a comma before a conjunction that joins the independent clauses in a compound sentence. And point two, use commas with non-essential dependent clauses that start with who or which or any relative pronoun for that matter. It means if a dependent clause functioning as an adjective is essential to specify its noun, it's not offset with commas. And when used to head an adjective dependent clause, which and who are relative pronouns. Such clauses are often called relative clauses. Remember that this rule doesn't apply only to who and which. It applies to any relative pronoun. And point three, use a comma after an adverbial dependent clause that sits before the independent clause. Don't use a comma before the clause if it follows the independent clause. It means using a comma after a fronted adverbial dependent clause is such a common style, it's becoming increasingly safe to call it a rule. The purpose of the comma is to aid reading. It shows your readers where the clause ends. Omitting a comma isn't a hideous crime, and lots of writers do it, even prefer it. But omitting the comma can cause your readers to stumble as they try to find the end of the dependent clause. Last but not least, point 4, there's more to point 3. Let's complicate the issue a bit. The rule that states do not use a comma when the adverbial clause follows the independent clause is not really the rule. In fact, the rule for postposition adverbial clauses is the same as postposition adjective clauses. In other words, use a comma if the adverbial clause is non-essential. The problem is that it's way more difficult to decide whether an adverbial clause is essential or non-essential than it is with an adjective clause, as the vast majority of adverbial clauses are essential. It's pretty safe, but not entirely safe, to declare that a postposition adverbial clause isn't preceded by a comma. So I think that's all I can explain to you guys about independent and dependent clause. I'm sorry if there are any wrong words and I'm sorry if my explanation is not good enough or not clear, and I want to say thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching my explanation video about independent and dependent clause. And I want to say thank you and goodbye, guys, and see you next time. Bye.